Okay, chapter 30. Chapter 30 is going to be talking about plants that actually make seeds. So in the previous chapter, those were going to be seedless plants, and now we're going to be talking about ones that make seeds. So the seed plants are considered to be more advanced, and that's because they can actually make this seed that can go dormant for like the winter or if it's really dry, and then they can grow when conditions are better. Whereas spores, it's kind of like, well, here we go, hope we can start growing because we don't have any sort of protection. So we've got gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are going to be ones that make the cones, and I've got examples here. So you've got your conifers, you've got cycads, neophytes, which are going to be these weird ones that grow in like very arid environments, and then you've got your ginkgo. So all of those are going to produce some sort of cone-like structure that's going to protect their seed, and the seed is going to rest on a scale, right? Then you've got your angiosperms, and the angiosperms are going to make a flower instead of a cone. And so if you remember from lab, these guys can be divided into monocots and dicots. So mono means one, di means two, and I'll show you where those names come from. So the word monocot comes from this area right here where it says one cotyledon. So when a seed is developing and the plant is growing inside, a monocot is only going to have one initial leaf. Whereas if you look here at the dicot is going to have two initial leaves coming out. So that's going to be the main difference where the name comes from. But there's other differences too. One difference is that if you look at the veins in the leaves of a monocot, the veins are all going to be going in the same direction. They're all going to be parallel. Whereas if you look at the veins in the leaf of a dicot, they're all branching out. Another difference is if you look at the stems are going to, in a monocot, have the xylem and phloem, which we just call vascular tissue, spread throughout the stem, whereas in a dicot, it's going to be arranged in a perfect circle around the outside. Some other differences, if I can get this to go. Don't worry about the roots or the pollen, but here the flowers, the floral parts, are usually going to be in multiples of 3 in a monocot, and in a dicot, they're going to be in multiples of 4 or 5. And what I mean by that is like if you were to count the anthers or if you were to count like the petals and stuff like that, they're usually going to be divided into those different multiples. So that's kind of a cool way to tell the difference. Another fun thing to do while you're on your next hike. You're welcome. Okay, now this next part here is talking about all the parts of a flower, and so we'll just kind of go through these as we look at this picture. I'll make that bigger. Okay, so this flower right here is going to have both male and female characteristics on it. But you can have some flowers that are just going to have male or just going to have female. So we'll talk about the male part first, and that's going to be these parts right here. So this kind of yellow with the maroon part up here. And so that's called the stamen. The way I remember that is because it's the male part and it has the word men in it. Use that if you want, don't use it if you don't want. Okay, so it's just going to be composed of the anther and the filament. The filament is just the stalk that's kind of holding up the anther, and the anther is going to be where pollen is produced. So the more mature the anther gets, the more pollen is going to be releasing. Then the female part of the plant is going to be called the carpel, and that's going to be the center part right here. So that's the stigma, style, ovary, and ovules. The way I remember this one is women tend to carpool more, and so carpel sounds like carpool. I don't know. Go with it if you want. If you don't, I understand. Okay, so let's talk about the parts. So the stigma is going to be at the top, and that's going to be sticky. And what that's going to allow is the pollen to stick to it. And then what's going to happen is that pollen is going to grow what's called a pollen tube down through this thing called the style, which is just a little channel, down here into the ovary, which contains the ovules. And eventually that pollen is going to reach one of these and fertilize it. And what's going to happen is this ovary here is going to become the fruit, and the ovules are going to become the seeds. So that's how that's going to work. So once again, if your friends are eating fruit, you could tell them they're eating mature ovaries. Oh, sorry. Okay, then we've got our petals here. Now, flower petals are usually very brightly colored. And the advantage to that is that that could attract pollinators, right? And if you think about it, flowers that open during the day have very, very beautiful colors. That's why we grow them in our yards and stuff. And that's to attract pollinators. But if you think about flowers that open at night, What color are they usually? They're usually whites. And the reason for that is because that's the easiest color to see at night. And if you think about things that bloom at night, like jasmine and stuff like that, they're usually extremely fragrant, almost to the point where you're like, whoa, that's too much. And that's because they are trying to attract pollinators without the pollinators having to see the flower. Okay, now these things here, these little leaves that are underneath the flower, those are called sepals, and those are going to protect that flower while it's just opening, right? And that's going to be all the parts of the flower. Okay, now, how a seed forms. So what's going to happen is you've got your seed forming once the pollen has fertilized the ovule, and it's going to start to develop that little plant inside, and then it's going to form this impermeable seed coat. And that's to protect it like throughout the winter or throughout a dry season or something like that. The seed and the fruit are going to help for that embryo to get dispersed to other locations, because that's a plant's goal, is to get dispersed to as many locations as possible. Now, as far as how seeds go, they are going to be really important because of the following reasons. First one, they can maintain dormancy. So, like I've been saying, if it's winter or if it's dry or if it's too hot or whatever, they can go dormant for a little while and then start growing when conditions are better, whereas spores, not so much. Seeds are going to protect that young plant when it's developing. So you've got these brand new leaves and a little flower or whatever might be forming in there, and you don't want that to be going through the soil and getting damaged. So it's going to do a lot of that development early on inside the seed where it's nice and protected. Now another one is that the seeds are going to have food that's going to permit that plant to grow without having to do photosynthesis. So let's say this is the surface of the soil and you plant the seed down here. It better have enough food in that seed for the plant to grow up to here, because up to here it has not done photosynthesis. Once it goes through, then it's going to be doing photosynthesis, and it's fine. But that's why if you ever planted seeds and maybe you planted them too deep and they never came up, that's why, most likely, is that they ran out of energy because they couldn't photosynthesize. All right? And then the fourth reason is that seeds are adapted for dispersal, which I've already mentioned. Now, there are going to be some specialized seeds, and they're going to act kind of crazy to make sure that they germinate into an area where some people might think it's very unfavorable. So you're going to have some seeds, like a lot of pine trees, that are going to be in cones, and they won't even get released until they've been exposed to a fire. Now, you might be thinking, why would that be advantageous? Well, think about what it looks like after a fire. There's no competition, which is nice, and there's tons of nutrients in the soil from all the things that got burned. So that's an evolutionary advantage. No competition, lots of nutrients, you can grow very strong. You're going to have some that are going to only germinate when they've leached out inhibitory chemicals. Now what I'm talking about there is there are going to be seeds, and in their seed coat they're going to have chemicals in there that are going to act as an herbicide. So when that seed gets exposed to enough water, it's going to leach those chemicals out in the soil and kill all the plants around it, so then it can start growing without competition. The other plus to that is that it has to be in contact with water to get triggered to do that, so it'll know that it has enough water to survive growing. And then the third one is there's going to be some seeds that will only germinate after they've gone through the digestive system of an animal. Now, if you think about that, it's going to go through the digestive system. What's it going to come out in? A huge pile of fertilizer. Lovely. And the other thing is that animals probably not staying still. It's probably going to a new location, which plants love because they want to get in as many locations as possible. So those are going to be those three things that they can do that's kind of crazy to ensure their germination. Now, this last part is going to be talking about fruits and different types of fruits that are out there. So the main point of a fruit is to ensure dispersal of the seed. And when we think of fruit, we think of like yummy, sweet fruit that you get at the store. And that definitely is fruit. But there are going to be some that aren't exactly that obvious. So the first type we've got are called follicles. This is a follicle right here. And so a follicle is going to open like this. So it's together and then it opens up like that. And a columbine is going to do that. So it's going to split along one carpel and then release its seeds that way. The next type are going to be legumes. And here's a picture of legumes right here. So a legume looks similar to a follicle, but they actually break completely apart. So legumes are going to be things like peas, beans, but also peanuts, right? If you think about a peanut shell, that breaks into two separate pieces, right? The next type is going to be a capsule. I don't think I have a picture of oh, I do, I lied. This is a capsule right here, and this is from a poppy plant. And so that's going to be full of tiny, tiny little seeds. Think of poppy seeds. And eventually that's going to burst open and release its seeds that way. Next one is called a samara. And sometimes you call samaras helicopters. This is like what maple trees are going to release. And obviously they have those big wings on them because they're going to use the wind to get from place to place. The next type is going to be called a drupe. And here is a picture of a drupe right here. What's going to be a drupe is that the seed is actually going to be encased in this hard pit, and then it's going to have fleshy fruit around it, right? So peaches and plums and apricots, those are all going to be examples of drupes. Okay, next one is called a papos. Papos is going to be where there's a hard outer rind, and then there's going to be fleshy fruit inside with lots of pretty big seeds. Watermelon, squash, pumpkins, those are all going to be in the papos category. All right, next one is going to be a nut. I did not put a picture of that in here, but think of like a walnut or a hazelnut. And so it's going to have that hard outer coating, and then when you crack it, the seed or the nut is inside of it. And the next one is going to be a true berry. These are all examples of true berries right here. And what's going to make a true berry is that they're going to have more than one seed. Whoops, sorry, I went a little bit too fast there. And a thin skin. So think about like blueberries or tomatoes. Now, when people see tomatoes, they're like, wait a minute, I thought a tomato was a vegetable. What we kind of tend to do is we think fruits are sweet, vegetables are not, but that's not really the case. Anything that has seeds in it is a fruit, technically. Vegetables are going to be a part of the plant that we eat. So if you think of like celery, celery is a stem of a plant, or lettuce, lettuce is the leaves of the plant. So that's how you can kind of differentiate between the two. Okay, Hesperidia. Hesperidia is going to have a very thick outer skin and then multiple seeds inside, and that's going to be the citrus family, grapefruits, lemons, limes, oranges. Pretty cool thing about these is that you can actually graft them onto other citrus trees, and you can have a tree, I actually had one in Florida, that had multiple types of citrus growing out off of it. So you can have oranges, grapefruits, and limes all growing on the same tree. So that's kind of a cool thing about those. All right. Now this next one, I believe is the next one in our, aggregate fruit. Now in aggregate fruit, if you look, it does look like there's a whole bunch of little fruits in there, right? And what that's going to be the result of, if you look here, is going to be from many ovaries of one flower. Now if we go back to that picture of the flower, I can kind of show you what I'm talking about. Wherever it is. There, oh God, went past it. I went past it again because I'm awesome. All right, so here's an ovary. So if you picture this flower with a bunch of these swollen areas down at the bottom, that's how you're going to end up with an aggregate fruit. Okay, so that's going to be like raspberries and like, blackberries and those types of things. Then the next one is called a multiple fruit, and a multiple fruit is going to be like a pineapple, and that's actually derived from multiple flowers growing together. So each one of these kind of sections that you see in here was a different flower that formed that fruit. So that's kind of neat too. And then the last one is going to be called a palm, and that's going to be like apples and pears. And that's where you're going to have like a hard outer core with the seed inside. So apples and pears are going to be a great example of that. So those are the different types of fruits, and they all have their reasons for growing the way they do. It could just be due to the type of flower they come from, or it could be due to the type of dispersal that they want to have. And then we're going to just finish up here with different types of ways that a fruit can be dispersed. One of them is the obvious one. Animals will eat them and distribute them. So any fruit that's very tasty, obviously an animal's going to eat that, possibly eat the seed, and then poop it out somewhere else. Then you've got hitchhikers, and hitchhikers going to be the ones like burrs and stuff where they're going to kind of stick onto you, like onto your fur or feathers or your shoelaces or whatever, and that's hitchhiking. Then you have animal burial, which I know sounds morbid, but we're talking about things like squirrels. They make little caches in the ground where they're going to dig a hole, put a bunch of nuts in there, and come back for them later. Well, they don't have perfect memories, and a lot of times they forget, and the trees depend on that because then they can grow. And then you've got wind, so you're going to have some that are going to use the wind to catch them and make them fly somewhere else. If you think about the maple samaras that are the helicopters, and then dandelions, they have that kind of flowy, kind of fluffy stuff around them. That would be for wind. And then the last one is going to be for water dispersal. And we talked about this in lab a little bit. Coconuts are going to have a big outer covering. They're actually a drupe. And that outer covering has a lot of air pockets in it, and that allows them to float and then grow in an island, and inhabit that island. In this one, you can actually see a little root starting to grow. And what happens is once they get to the sand, the roots start to grow. They have hormones in them that tell them what direction is down, and then they'll grow into a palm tree. And then another one that's going to use water dispersal is going to be the mangrove. This is a mangrove seed propagule right here. And these guys just kind of bob along vertically like that, and then eventually they'll start to grow little roots out from under them. And so you can see these are a couple that have started to grow roots here. And this is what they look like when they grow into a full tree. And what happens is they're going to eventually touch the bottom, and then they actually start to trap sediment. And that's how a lot of islands form. Like the Florida Keys is a perfect example. And so here's one growing right here, and you can see the roots growing down like that. So those are all going to be for seed-producing plants. So the later chapters are going to get into like more plant anatomy type of